I will talk a little bit about the PASTA project just in general. Then I'll pass it on to Esther, who's going to give us some preliminary results of what our sample looks like. And I thought I would provide some highlights of some of the research we did, where we compared stakeholders to some literature reviews. I think we might skip that just to have more time for discussion, because it seems like we're all running a bit late. But we'll see what time it is by the time I get to it. So I probably don't really need to explain this here, but of course we all know there's a huge disconnect between the planning practices and health practices. And just to reiterate on some of the big public health challenges that we are aware of today, we know that, for example, physical inactivity or lack of physical activity is associated, is the fourth greatest risk factor for mortality worldwide. So huge impact on public health. And in Europe, in particular, only a third of the population meets the recommended levels of physical activity, which is simply 30 minutes, 5 days a week. So not much, but many people don't reach those recommended levels of physical activity. And here comes in the idea of active transportation, so walking and cycling to go places as a means to integrate healthy levels of physical activity as part of your daily lives. So it's free, affordable for most people, and it's also something that you don't have to put aside some specific time for it, because you can just integrate that as part of your daily routines. So huge potential from active transportation to really tackle one of the biggest public health challenges today. So this is where we come in with PASTA. Our big challenge is, okay, we see this as an opportunity, but what is it that's going to make people walk and bike as means of transportation more? So the PASTA project is an EU-funded project that with partners across Europe. And it's about understanding what can be done to promote active transportation, walking and cycling, and what are the health implications of active travel policies. So that's what we're about. And basically PASTA had three, has more, but the three major strands of research. One is based on workshops and interviews with stakeholders to understand what are the barriers and motivations to increase active transportation policies, and also to develop a compendium of best practices to promote active transportation. The biggest block of the PASTA project, I should have said PASTA stands for Physical Activity Through Sustainable Approaches, Sustainable Transport Approaches. The biggest block of the research, which is what Esther is going to talk about next, is a longitudinal survey, so a survey that we are conducting over time, that we're doing in 7 different cities in Europe. And in London is one of those cities, and it's based right here in East London, where our focus is here in East London, as we'll say in a few seconds. And then there's a third component, which is health impact assessment. So understanding the impacts of active transportation and active transportation policies. And as part of that, we're not only developing research type health impact assessment models, but we're also helping the WHO, the World Health Organization, provide a new tool or an updated tool called the HEAT tool, which is the Health Economics Assessment tool for walking and cycling, so that people across Europe or the world can just make their own back of the envelope calculations using this tool on health impacts of walking and cycling. So those are 7 case studies: Vienna, Zurich, Antwerp, Barcelona, Orbro, Rome, and London. And again, as I've said, the reason we chose London as one of the case studies is we want to take advantage of all what's happening around regeneration. And of course, I've heard this morning that we need to be careful about what we say, of whether it's associated, it's a result of the Olympic Park or not. And we're making the very gross simplification of all of that is happening is something to do with the regeneration around East London in the Olympic Park area. We're not really going into the debate of what caused that those specific measures. Esther is going to say a few things about what are the specific measures we're considering, but things that are happening in this area that might lead to more walking and cycling is what we're interested in. So just to give you a sense of what the project is about, we started last October. Well, actually, a year and a half ago, we started a longitudinal survey. We have different bits of extra information, extra little studies that we're doing on. We're trying to also look at air pollution exposures and as part of people's daily activities and health implications of that as well. We're still recruiting people right now, so we have flyers somewhere which we'll pass around because we're still recruiting people. It's important that we are able to have a large sample so that we can come up with some real answers on whether the policies and the measures that were implemented really have an impact on active transportation. So we'd be very grateful if you could participate in the PASTA survey. We're currently starting to process and analyze the data. Esther is going to show some of this right now, and then we'll of course end up with policy recommendations. So and of course end up with dissemination. So I'm going to pass this on now to Esther, and we'll see if at the end we have a bit of time on the stakeholder analysis.
Okay, so thank you everyone for your interest in this session. My name is Esther Anaya. I'm doing my PhD supervised by Audrey, and I'm doing a specific part of analysis within the big project that Audrey has just presented, the PASTA project. So in this project there are the 7 cities participating as a case study cities. And our goal is to have 2,000 participants for each city. That's very challenging. We have, as Audrey was explaining, a survey going on. This survey is constituted by several questionnaires, a very big baseline questionnaire at the beginning, in which we ask all sorts of information, not only social demographics, but also questions about health and transport and physical activity mainly. And every 3 weeks, the participants receive a follow-up question of 5 to 10 minutes in which they give us feedback. And our aim is to trace if there is any change in their attitudes, in their behavior in terms of active travel, so walking and cycling. And there will be a final questionnaire, a very big one, also very comprehensive at the end of the project this month of October, November, to be able to do this before and after comparison that we think it's going to lead us to have an impact evaluation assessment, which is what my work is about. So close to the end of the survey, we are now reaching our goal, so that is good news. In London, it has been specifically challenging because of the recruitment strategy, to make people really sit down, Londoners, sit down and do a half an hour questionnaire is really challenging. And specifically, if you look into the East London subsample of participants, and maybe some of them, they don't have access to internet or to computers. So we've done a lot of work of going across the street to the library, to the IT sessions, to help people with vouchers, motivate them to fill in the survey, help them doing it, recruit on the streets in Stratford Station, is some of our activities and strategies to keep this subsample that we really think it's very valuable in this specific area to be doing our survey. Currently, we have some of the statistics of our samples. As you see, there's more female than male. This is quite extraordinary. Age distribution, quite young, but not as young as one might think, like people having access to these electronic devices. So we're moving to an older age, which is also good for our sample. And in terms of social income, household income, I think the distribution is quite interesting as well. It's not only one side or the other. As you can see, it's quite evenly distributed. So we expect to have a representative sample in that sense. But in terms of educational level, the higher education people is very, very important in our sample. We have done a lot of effort in recruiting much more wider sample in this particular aspect, but so far it's more focused in the higher education. As we were saying, we are going to focus in East London. For us it's very important, and especially for my analysis, to see the impact of some of the policies, some of the interventions going on in this area. So we've done a particular effort in recruiting people from the East London. That means 4 boroughs. As you see, we have been focusing specifically Newham because Newham is particularly a partner of the project, so they kind of receive money to be in this project. The other boroughs don't, so they just collaborate, and we have been working with them with communication strategies to help us reach these numbers that you have seen in the recruitment. So currently we have the biggest sample in Newham, and then we have quite a nice sample in Waltham Forest because we have been working with them trying to evaluate the Mini Holland scheme. You all probably know what this scheme is about. It's a traffic calming scheme going on in Waltham Forest. And we then have Tower Hamlets and Hackney. These 4 boroughs are going to be our case study boroughs. So we're going to look at policy interventions mainly in these boroughs here, around the Queen Elizabeth Park. So for us in London, and this is the only city in which this particular question was introduced, the ethnicity is a very relevant subject. So we have made also an effort in trying to recruit people of all kinds of ethnicities. This is our results currently. So basically we have the biggest sample with white people, but in Newham we have managed, and I think this recruitment strategy on going on the street, on the libraries, and these civic centres and the stations, we've managed to get a more diverse sample, and it's the one borough that has more diversity in that sense. In terms of sex, we have already looked at that. Yeah, it's interesting. There is some variability there. And the income is also quite interesting. I think we were already looking at it for the whole sample, and for East London, we have managed to get also some quite nice distribution there, as you can see in the pies. And then we get into the bit that I am going to analyze. So what I want to do in my PhD is what we call an impact evaluation model of the policy interventions, the things that are going on in terms of the built environment in relation to cycling in East London. With this, I want to look at the possible impact in people's behavior, so their attitudes towards cycling and their actual behavior in terms of cycling, if they increase their levels of cycling or if they take up cycling because of new interventions going on in the area, putting in place in the area. So there are a lot of questions. When I started to look at this big question, there are a lot of sub-questions that came out. There's some evidence in the literature already showing some bits that we are missing, some gaps that we could look at. And this is implemented in my analysis in the ways that I will explain in a minute. But yeah, we have that perception of people, perception of their built environment might be even more important than the built environment itself. And we don't know yet, there's no agreement in the literature which interventions and policies are more effective, and I would add for which groups of population, so that's not clear. Yeah, and then again, the groups of populations are very important, so it might be the case that policies need to be targeted. We need to check that out. And the literature says policy packages might be more effective, so more than one policy going on at the same time might make a bigger effect on people's behavior than only one policy or going out for one single intervention at a time. So to capture this multiplicity of interventions going on is also one of the big challenges of my particular analysis. And then quality matters. How do we integrate that into the model? So it's not the same thing doing a particular intervention of lower quality than doing it in a much bigger quality, because that's going to attract more people, that's going to motivate people more. So basically, I was asking myself, what influences people to cycle? And that means looking into behavior change towards cycling, and then I will explain in a minute how am I going to look into that. And then how can we promote it? Which policy interventions are more effective, as we were saying, for the promotion of cycling? So for the behavioral change, we, in the PASTA project, we developed a conceptual framework which is based in an existing theory. This is from theoretical model of the 5 stages of change, in which there are 5 stages in which people can be classified in terms of their behavior, in this case cycling. And then I would like to look into this particular framework in 2 particular ways. So one would be one more a static vision, a cross-sectional vision, vision that we normally speak about, which is locating people in the different stages. So each one of our participants are going to be located in each of these stages. And once we have that, and we have the before and after, so the 2 big questionnaires I was talking about before, once we have that, we will be able to see if there is some movement. People like Julie, for example, maybe might come from here to straight to action, huh? But normally what we're going to see is this kind of movements in between the stages, hopefully up, but it can happen also down. So we will see. We have a set of questions. I've tried to just briefly put there what we are based to diagnose people into each of the stages. And all these questions are in our questionnaire. So the idea is to assess if people answer these questions in the beginning of the project, of the survey, in one sense, and they change that answer at the end of the project. So to recap, just to say the stage diagnosis is going to be one of the part of the behavioral change analysis, and then the stage change would be the other side. Well, we still don't have the final questionnaire, but for example, to give you a hint, we have one of the questions. This question is related to, the change in between these 2 first stages, so pre-contemplation to contemplation. So people who have never thought and have no intention of taking up cycling, and people who have been thinking of maybe they would do it. So we have this question of the intention for cycling in the future, and as you see, we have a quite a diverse approach in each of the cities, which is going to be really interesting. That is one of the values, I think, of doing this kind of projects at an international, at a European level, because we have different case studies. We'll be able to contrast them, to compare them. And one of our hypotheses is that if the environment is different for each participant and for each city, that might make a difference in people's behavior. So this kind of first question that I am presenting here, just a hint for you to know, it might back up this hypothesis that really this make a difference. The different built environments might build different approaches, different attitudes of people towards the behavior of cycling in this case. We will see at the end of the project how that goes. And just to present you an example of which kind of measures we're looking at in our project. As I said, the idea is to look at the before and after of the implementation of these measures. So we're basically selecting measures that have taken place in between the starting of the survey and the end of the survey. So more or less over these 2 years, over the last 1 year and a half and the future half a year until the end of the year. And some of them are the Cycle Superhighway 2 extensions and upgrade. We always think about this East London area of the 4 boroughs around the Queen Elizabeth Park. The quiet ways and greenways, the leeway, for example, are examples. Probably the Waltham Forest Mini Holland, if we manage to get a bigger enough sample, will also be analyzed. And then there is another question, extra question for smaller interventions, like a question saying, are there any other small things going on that might help you to change your behavior, that might have influenced in your behavior, to keep it open, because we cannot control for everything happening. So we want to know really if there are some inputs to the changes we might observe from these questions.
Okay, you got 3 minutes.
Okay. Then just to tell you how measuring the exposure to people. So this exposure language comes from the health sector, because the idea is to measure these interventions as some kind of treatment that will provide a beneficial outcome, which will be people taking up a positive activity, a beneficial activity for their health, which is cycling. So we're measuring that, doing a dose response analysis in which the number of interventions that one person is exposed to is influential, and that is measured by making a buffer around the proximity of the intervention. So if you have a cycle lane being built in your street and you are close enough, that might influence you more than if you are not close enough and not exposed to that intervention. So, and here the multiplicity of the policy packages, or the multiplicity of interventions being more effective, is tried to be captured with this kind of analysis, like overlapping buffers. People exposed to more than one intervention should be more feasible to change their behavior or their attitudes. Then we also are going to do an environment assessment, so try to look into what's the built environment in each of the cases. We are using an index called the bikeability index, in which we are measuring the bicycle friendliness of the environment of people. So just in the baseline questionnaire, so at the beginning of the survey, what was the environment? That will have an index, a score, and then at the end it will have another score. Let's see if that changes also, if that makes an impact. And finally, we think the quality is important. So it's not about only building whatever we want to build. It's also in a technical kind of observational way, if this kind of infrastructure is good enough to actually provoke the change. So that we think is relevant to measure quality as well, and we're going to integrate that as well.
Okay, so this is great. So I'm just going to, if we have 1 minute, finish by saying, okay, we've got lots of partners to thank, and those are all partners. And also, please, if you can, it's not too late to participate in the PASTA project. Also, I'm currently applying for some funds from NIHR to continue, because there are lots of things that were not implemented in time and that are going to be implemented in the future. If you have any interest in participating in this, again, I'm trying to apply for some funds right now, and there's going to be an opportunity to expand the analysis to things that maybe were not initially considered and that you might find of interest. So we'd be delighted to hear more. So please contact us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My programs work because thousands of people talk about them on social media and email me to tell me that they've just done this, that and the other. I found it really difficult to access funding and to grow my business because I don't have the hard, firm evidence that my programs work. But there are some changes happening with organisations such as Sport England that are now going to be, through their funding strategies, working more with entrepreneurs similar to myself that don't have the funding or the team to do those kind of more academic, evidence-based pieces of research. I do simple things on SurveyMonkey to show change. I often measure things that perhaps Sport England and Public Health wouldn't be that interested in, which is more things to do with happiness, which for women is really key to how active they are. And to do with just mindset changes. So it's much more broader than just a run-in and a physical activity program. It's about how women feel empowered to make changes in their lives.
That's great. That better captures. It doesn't necessarily have to be high science. I think just being able to sort of pull together some numbers around what you're getting there would be really fascinating.
I have bits and pieces of evidence.
I want to know what happened to the Red Bridge Oldies.
I don't know.
Oh no!
Sadly, I do bump into them occasionally. Sadly, I reckon some of them are probably no longer here.
Well, I did worry about that.
But actually, one of them has just been in Rio, a lady called Leslie. So she volunteered in Redbridge, was part of the older people's group, and she went on to volunteer in Rio. So I mean, that's one lady that I know of. I mean, it's hard once you've left an organisation to track everybody. But
I mean, that relates to your point, doesn't it? The fact that this kind of project would be really, really great if you could have those kind of statistics.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, sorry. Yes.
Yeah. Also for Julie. So it sounds like you initially were employed by Newham or?
Lots of different organisations, Newham, Redbridge.
And I guess my question is, does it take somebody exceptional like you to make things suddenly happen, to get something out of something like the Olympic Games? Or were there things that were put in place to make it happen anyway? Like, do you think it's?
I think it's personality led. I mean, one of the interesting things about working on the Olympics is that lots of people were working on the Olympics that were not experts, so it was new to everybody, and it enabled me to be a bit of a maverick and to go into local authorities that are quite set in their ways and say, well, look, you've got nothing to compare this to, just let me do it my way. And most of the time they would let me because they didn't know what to do, and there was never budgets to do anything. So the older people thing, they were meeting anyway, they had a space. I had a dance background, so I was just like, we'll do this thing. You know, we didn't have a budget for costumes or any of these things, but we just found a way of making it happen.
It's very interesting, isn't it? All the projects are, in one way or another, trying to sort of find a link about cultural change. How do you measure it? How do you bring it about? How do you reflect on it? You know, and I think the small businesses that you studied as well, I think it's really fascinating from a cultural perspective. You know, to see what's happened, what's changed, how those people have moved on. I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that from the sort of cultural perspective of the impacts.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that was important to our project was focusing on the experiences that people had had, and not just in the immediate aftermath of the compulsory purchase, talking about the CPO itself, but as it had become part of their memory, effectively too. You know, for some businesses, the negotiations and issues of compensation and so on have been ongoing, and in fact one or two cases are not yet complete even now. But for others, the move happened 9 years ago almost, and they've moved on, and so it was quite interesting getting that sense of a different kind of temporality, I guess, depending on what the kind of outcome had been